Assalamualaikum, my name is Arfat and welcome to a brand new video. In today's video, I'd like to read to you a chapter from Deuteronomy and the Pentateuch by Jeffrey Stackett. Now, there's a lot of questions out there as to whether Deuteronomy and Pentateuch, what are their relations to one another. Is Deuteronomy written around the same time as the Pentateuch were written, or was it written centuries and centuries ago? And what are the influences on the book of Deuteronomy and the Pentateuch as a whole when it comes to the greater ancient Near Eastern context? In today's video, I will be more concerned in discussing Deuteronomy and the Pentateuch and its ancient Near Eastern context when it comes to similarities or parallels between the literatures that we found in ancient Near East and Deuteronomy. Now, if you are familiar with the study of the Pentateuch and Deuteronomy and the Pentateuch, now there's a lot of debates going on as to whether the ancient Near East literatures influence Deuteronomy, or Deuteronomy and the Pentateuch as a whole were influenced by the ancient Near Eastern literature. Now, currently the scholarship weighs more to the side whereby there is no direct influence. Even though some scholars would argue that there is, and some books have been written this way, but I'm still convinced that even though there are similarities between the ancient Eastern literature, like the flood narrations, for example, the treatise of Esarhaddon, for example, when it comes to comparing it to the literatures or the stories that are even found somewhat similar. Now, if you are also familiar with the work of Dennis MacDonald when it comes to mimetic criticism of the Gospels and Plato and the Greek literatures, for example. So this is basically the same thing when it comes to the Hebrew Bible, but I'm less convinced. I'm more convinced that mimetic criticism is actually something that should be weighed even more. But I'm not convinced when it comes to the Hebrew Bible literature and the ancient Near Eastern texts. And so it is whilst there could be similarities, and indeed there are parallels even, but there is no connection to say between the two. There is no, we have not found any link. Whilst there could be something that is similar from one end, and then another thing that is similar on the other side somewhere else in other places of the world, it could just be a coincidence. Even though some scholars would question this, how can it be a coincidence whereby we have many similarities and parallels? Like we have the same flood narrative story, even though the details are different, but the overall concept is the same. It's just like the Gospels. The details are different, but the overall concept are the same. Especially amongst the synoptics, and so it is somewhat being argued that way as well for the Hebrew Bible. But in my opinion, I'm less convinced because the evidence is, the evidence weighing more towards that side. And I think those scholars who say that there are similarities, whereas the evidence to actually link that they are actually interconnected, that the people writing source A and source B actually corroborate, or that they depend on source C. For example, there is just no evidence for this, and so the whole thing is still a coincidence, even though it is a quote unquote a major coincidence. But because there is no proven artifacts or proven writings or any extant things, for example, whereby we can connect the two, that the two is actually connected. And so right now, even though we have the same flood narratives as to the Bible and the ancient Eastern texts, All we have to say is that because there is no evidence to actually link the two, okay, it is just a coincidence. And so this is something that I still adopt, okay, and a lot of other scholars adopt as well. Without further ado, let's turn to reading this again: Deuteronomy and the Pentateuch, published by Yale University Press. And this is part of the Anchor Yale Bible Reference Library. So, reading here from page 86, chapter 3, sorry, page 87. This section is called Deuteronomy and the Second Millennium Hittite Treatise. Though scholars have largely rejected the claim for the direct influence of Hittite treatise upon Deuteronomy, it is important to address the similarities between Deuteronomy and the Hittite vessel treatise that have been identified and why arguments for influence should be rejected. Similarities identified between Deuteronomy and Hittite materials relate to both genre and content, though the former ties have proved more influential in the history of scholarship and continue to endure, if often in modified form. That is, even among those who have rejected direct Hittite influence in Deuteronomy, the possibility that Deuteronomy's genre is nonetheless informed by the same broad ancient Near Eastern treaty tradition to which the Hittite text belong is still acknowledged. In this general sense, it is claimed that Deuteronomy and the Hittite treatise participate in a common ancient Near Eastern social milieu. Yet this is a very different argument than one of the direct Hittite influence in Deuteronomy. As I discuss here, the extent of the differences between Deuteronomy and the Hittite treatise has not been fully recognized. One of the benefits of re-examining this comparison, then, is to sharpen a description of Deuteronomy's distinctiveness. It also underscores important methodological issues that arise again in evaluating the possible influence, of the Esarhaddon treatise upon Deuteronomy. The discussion of cuneiform treaty influences upon biblical material was set in motion by George E. Mendenhall, who in 1954 published a study of the formal features of biblical and other ancient Near Eastern covenant or treaty texts that included an extended discussion of similarities between Hittite treaty materials and Hexateuchal covenant texts. Meaning it includes the Pentateuch and all the other books, Kings as well. On the basis of the formal similarities he identified, Mendenhall argued for the influence of the Hittite treaty genre in the Hebrew Bible. As I discussed below, this study inspired subsequent scholars who sought to apply Mendenhall's work more systematically to Deuteronomy. In this comparison of biblical and Hittite material, Mendenhall drew especially from Victor Korosek's analysis of the Hittite treaty form. Korosek identifies 6 elements of this genre. Number 1, preamble. Number 2, historical prologue. Number 3, stipulations. Number 4, provisions for deposit and public reading. Number 5, list of divine witnesses. And 6, curses and blessings formula. Mendenhall isolated 3 examples in the Hebrew Bible, and he identified as comparable to the Hittite suzerainty treaty type, the Decalogue, Deuteronomy, and Joshua 24. In a highly positivistic historical reconstruction, he characterized the Decalogue as the paradigmatic covenant of this type in Israelite history. Mendenhall focused especially on the Decalogue found in Exodus and identified in that scroll its historical prologue and stipulations in accordance with the Hittite treaty form. In his view, the account of the Israelites' deliverance from Egypt was the historical prologue, and the Decalogue's commands constituted the stipulations. Mendenhall also identified one or more enactments, ceremonies in Exodus 24:3-8, which he viewed as reflecting the ratification events that necessarily attended Hittite treaty making, even if evidence for such events was lacking. At the same time, he acknowledged that formal elements, 4 to 6, which is deposit and public reading, divine witnesses, curses and blessings, do not appear alongside the Decalogue. Neither is there an oath, which Mendel asserted must have been part of the Hittite treaty procedure. Yet he downplayed these missing elements, arguing that they are otherwise important parts of Israelite religious traditions, as attested elsewhere in the Hebrew Bible. In the same publication, Mendenhall also commented at some length on Joshua 24, but his treatment of Deuteronomy was cursory. In the few observations he did offer, Mendenhall characterized Deuteronomy as a compromised version of the suzerainty covenant model, one that was innovative in its ability to accommodate monarchy, but whose philosophy or theory of history became in popular thought at least a caricature of the original structure of religion. Potentially against his form critical thesis, he also stated, as the tradition in Deuteronomy indicates, the curses and blessings may not have been regarded as an element in the text of the covenant, but as an action which accompanied the ratification of the covenant. With regard to divine witnesses, Mendenhall initially entertained an interpretation of the geographical features in Deuteronomy 32 verse 1 as demythologized treaty witnesses, but he ultimately disparaged their effectiveness. Later materials, like Deuteronomic texts, do make poetic use of this legal pattern in spite of the fact that they really do not succeed in walking on all fours, so to speak. If Mendenhall's form critical assessment of Deuteronomy was equivocal and underdeveloped, scholars subsequently sought to apply Korosak's identification of the Hittite suzerainty treaty genre to Deuteronomy more systematically. For example, scholars such as Meredith G. Klein and Peter C. Craigie characterize all or nearly all of the Deuteronomy scroll according to the Hittite treaty form. Klein's analysis was comprehensive. Preamble, which is Deuteronomy 1:1-5, historical prologue, stipulation, sanctions, and succession arrangement or covenant continuity. Craig's delineation was only slightly less so, and give a bunch of range here, which I will not read. Less ambitious in relation to both Deuteronomy and the treaty form were the claims of Moshe Weinfeld and Dennis J. McCarthy. Even as he identified in Deuteronomy the treaty's elements found in the Hittite text, Weinfeld argued against any direct Hittite influence, preferring instead a first millennium borrowing via the Assyrian tradition. In particular, for his part, McCarthy limited his identification of the treaty genre to 3 elements in Deuteronomy, which is introduction, stipulation, and conclusion, which includes oath, right, blessing, and curse. A major factor in the more modest claims of Weinfeld and McCarthy, and the persistent challenge to any claim of Hittite influence upon Israelite and Judean texts, is the question of vectors of transmission for such influence. Mendenhall sought to discount this problem already in his initial study, even if he could not solve it. He argued, correctly, that the Hittite treaties were almost certainly examples of a wider ancient Near Eastern genre. As an international form, this genre could have reached Israel or Judah in a number of ways. Mendenhall also noted that some Hittite treaties were concluded with people groups in Syria, northern Mesopotamia, a region where Israelite ancestors, for example the patriarchs like Abraham, had known ties. Finally, he pointed to connections that other scholars had posited between biblical and Hittite materials. Basically, to summarize, what they're actually arguing is that scholars like Mendenhall, even though he could not prove that there's actually link between the two texts, Deuteronomy, Pentateuch, and like Book of Joshua. Okay, basically all the way. If like recent scholarship want to extend all the way to the Book of Kings, even the story of David, so on and so forth. Okay, and so all this, even though there are similarities between these narratives in the Hebrew Bible and the ancient Near Eastern texts, the fact that we cannot find any chain that actually links between the two, okay, it is something that Mendenhall discount completely, even though he could not explain why. Okay, he basically assumes that because there's similarities and parallels. I'm just using the word assume, but just for convenience sake. Okay, but he doesn't really actually assume. Okay, but to put it in blatant form, because there are similarities between the two, that means there must be some borrowing, there must be some copying, there must be some influence, even though there's no proven chain, okay, that actually connects that these two sources were written by someone that actually knows them. Even though the claim of Abraham is there, because Abraham started in Mesopotamia and then he traveled all the way to Egypt, so on and so forth. So Abraham could have brought up these stories, so on and so forth. Like for example the flood narratives. Okay, all these were before Abraham, because Abraham came after Noah way later, if you look at it chronologically. But then again, there is no evidence that Abraham actually carried this text. Okay, and the scholarships is that Abraham is not a historical figure. Yeah, this is according to like historical scholarship. Abraham is not a historical figure. It is a mythology. It is figure, but basically that's made up, like Romulus, for example. Okay, and so all these, that's why scholarships are not able to argue that way. But during the time of Mendenhall, this wasn't the view of the majority of the scholarships. But today the view of the scholarship is that Abraham is not a historical figure. But anyway, I digress. We can go on and talk about this on the next video. But scholars like Moshe Weinfeld, quite recently also, argue, okay, when I say recently is within the past century, argue that the theory that there is a connection between the two cannot be proven, because there's just no connection between the two. Okay. More recently, Joshua Berman has advocated strongly for Hittite influence in Deuteronomy. Yet he has also been forced to admit that any claim for specific cultural contact is conjectural, meaning they're just wild guesses. His conclusion thus ultimately mirrors Mendenhall's. It may be that in due time you will unearth more treaties from other periods and locales, and that the treaty elements in Deuteronomy may represent a higher refracted reworking of a tradition that we witness today only in Hittite material. Okay. You can go on and read. You can find this book in, I'm sure, your public library or like National Library, for example. But basically, to summarize the whole thing, as also to add on what I've just mentioned, is that a lot of scholars today, they have been trying to argue the influence of the ancient Near Eastern texts in the Hebrew Bible. Okay, as well as scholars like Dennis MacDonald have tried to argue since the year 2000, to argue that the mimetic criticism is something that we should actually consider, and that the Gospels were influenced by Homer, Gospel of Mark, for example. Even though this sort of thinking has not garnered a lot of followings among scholarship, basically because there is no chain that connects them. Even though there are similarities between this text and that text, there are no chain that actually connects them. But for the mimetic criticism, it is something that has more weight, because we know that the ancient Mediterranean education is basically based on reading ancient Greek quote-unquote mythology. Okay, and so that is the rhetoric school. Okay, that is the school whereby the Hellenized people, like Hellenized Jews, Hellenized pagans, for example. These are the sort of education that they were actually they were getting. And so the mimetic criticism is something that has more weight because we have evidence that the ancient Greeks, the ancient Mediterraneans, okay, the Romans in the ancient Mediterraneans, they were studying Greek literature. Okay, they basically took over Greeks culture and gods, their deities. They just give it a different name, and then they brought the whole thing and make it theirs. Basically, they just steal the ancient Greek cultures and ideas and incorporate it into their own culture and ideas, which is not distant to the Greek culture as well. And so, mimetic criticism, as argued by Dennis MacDonald, it is something that is much stronger, because when it comes to the Hebrew Bible, there is just no evidence that actually link between the ancient Near Eastern texts and those of the flood narratives, for example, okay, the creation story, for example. And so some of the laws, for example, in the book of Numbers and Leviticus. So there's just no link between the two, even though we found parallels in here and there. So that is basically what the chapter is about. Now, the last phrase that I read you, that maybe we might unearth more things in the future, and this is what some scholars have used to argue. These are assumptions. Okay, it might seem like a really great argument if you verbalize it, but when it comes to writings and when it comes to scholarship, this is something that is based out of assumption. And something that is based of assumption can neither be true or can neither be false. Okay, and so it is just something that is we don't know. And so if we don't know something, we cannot actually use that as an argument, okay, because it is your evidence. There's no evidence to begin with, okay, and your assumption has not been proven correct, and it has also not been disproven because we do not know. So we cannot use assumption to argue, especially when it comes to academics and scholarships. Okay, and so as such, my position is still that even though if you read the ancient Eastern texts, for example, or even if you study the ancient Near East, like there's a great book you're reading from the ancient Near East. Okay, there's tons of flood stories. You can find a lot of similar literatures in the Hebrew Bible. But there is just no connection between the two. And so what could be the plausible theories that scholars have proposed is that this has to do with the documentary hypothesis. And you have to understand Joel Baden's work, the composition of the Pentateuch. I can't remove it, but the composition of the Pentateuch, which is also part of the Anchor Yale Bible Reference Library. So the composition of the Pentateuch is the sources, okay, the division of the sources, the Yahweh source. But then again, there is still no evidence that the Yahwehs or the Elohis actually copies or have access to the ancient Near Eastern texts. Okay, there's just no evidence. Well, some scholars have argued whereby people traveling from one land to another land, they will bring literatures from Mesopotamia all the way to the ancient land of Canaan, for example. Okay, all these are theories, and no doubt there were definitely traveling people back then here and forth. Like, for example, I just traveled to Uzbekistan and I bought some artifacts here and there, and so it influenced I introduced artifacts to my local community, and so there could be some cross-cultural thing here, definitely, but it is just we have no extant evidence. Okay, sure, it seems like highly plausible that people bring literatures here and there. Okay, but in what form were they bringing it? Oral tradition, most likely, because I mean, writings are something that a lot of ancient people could not read and write. Yeah. And what materials would they be using to write in the 8th century, for example? Well, what do we know? Cuneiform tablets. And cuneiform tablets do not last long. But even though, how do we know? Because we have not found these cuneiform tablets. Okay, so while it is basically a plausibility in the higher grades, because there is just no evidence, extant evidence, and so we cannot be certain for sure. But if we were to use educated guesses, no doubt, definitely, it is highly plausible. Yeah, because the historians depends on probability, and the probability as to the travelers from Mesopotamia all the way to Canaan, that they actually brought stories, okay, be it in cuneiform tablets or in oral tradition. Okay, they would tell stories to the Elohis, okay, to the Yahwehs, okay, and these people would hear and then they would write these materials, something like that. This is, from a historical perspective, a very, very highly probable and plausible theory. Okay. Now, if we were to bring some theology in here, yeah, because this channel is history and theology, and so far we have discussed a lot of history, we've not discussed a lot of theology. Orthodox Jews believe that the entire Torah was revealed by Moshe in Mount Sinai. And there's the oral Torah and there's the written Torah. Depending on which Orthodox Jews you speak to, some would say that only the Torah in the strictest sense, meaning the Pentateuch, the first 5 books of Moses. Others would say the entire thing is inspired and were revealed by Moses. Now, this is something even theologically incorrect, okay, because we have Isaiah, Ezekiel, Nehemiah, Jeremiah. Okay, all these people were later the prophetic writings. Okay, and so it is more correct, even theologically, that these prophets actually wrote this book. Even though historically we know that there's probably Isaiah, 3rd Isaiah, for example, meaning Isaiah, we have the prophet Isaiah, which highly likely wrote the first part of the book of Isaiah, and then the middle part was written by probably the disciples of Isaiah. Then the third one probably the tabi'in of Isaiah, And so this is the theory that scholars have came out with. Again, we have no evidence whatsoever that Isaiah wrote, even the first book of Isaiah. Okay, the first Isaiah, for example, we have no evidence that Isaiah wrote this book. From a theological perspective, a lot of Jews believe. Okay, and so from a theological perspective, what do we make of the argument that Jeffrey Stackert has actually written here, even though he was quoting different people? Well, if you are an Orthodox Jew and if you abide strictly to your theology, you would declare people who believe in Weidenhal's theory, for example, or even Moshe Weinfeld. Okay, you would declare them to be heretics. Okay, and if you declare that the Moses copy from the ancient Eastern text, like the flood narratives, for example, that we found in the book of Genesis, then you are basically a heretic. Okay, if you adopt from the Orthodox Jews' position from a theological perspective. Okay, the author mentioned Moshe Weinfeld. I want to recommend you the book that he actually mentioned. Okay, Deuteronomy and the Deuteronomistic School by Moshe Weinfeld. Or Weinfeld. I call it Weinfeld, but probably Weinfeld is correct. Moshe Weinfeld. I've made reviews of this book in the past, if I'm not mistaken. But yeah, if you want to know more about the Torah and the ancient Eastern parallels, you can get this book. Okay, obviously you can get the Torah as well. And if you want to know about the sources, you can actually read this book or even Joe Biden's work. Highly recommend. But anyway, ladies and gentlemen, my name is Arfat. I'll see you on my next video. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.